First up is the new space race film, Fly Me to the Moon. It stars Scarlett Johansson and Channing Tatum. And just to set the stage a little bit, the first thing I saw of this film was the poster, and it looked terrible. The poster just looks cheesy and weird and bad, and that's not to say the film is cheesy and weird and bad, but, a poster is oftentimes the first impression you get of a film, and so when it doesn't make a great first impression, you tend to lower your expectations. And then I heard the premise of it, which is basically, it's set during the space race in the 60s, and Channing Tatum plays a NASA person, flight controller, something, I can't remember, like operations director, and Scarlett Johansson plays a PR person, and it's her job to sell the space race to the American public. It's sort of a will they, won't they romantic comedy, but given the two leads involved, more likely than not it's going to be a they will, because you don't have people that attractive without putting them together, which, all right, it's fine. I was expecting that. Like I said, I went in with the lowest expectations in the galaxy, ? Maybe not the lowest, but as a byproduct, I was actually pleasantly surprised by this film. I had a fair number of laughs, it wasn't as arduous an experience as I was expecting, but I was expecting the worst, so you have to kind of adjust your expectations based on that. Now, is it a great film? No, certainly not. Like I said, it is better than what I was expecting based on the poster. This film is by far too long. There are too many convoluted things that get in the way of their relationship, and also the space race in general. And I'm a huge fan of anything that involves space and NASA, etc. It's one of those topics where you're just like, what is there not to like about space exploration? Now, you have Scarlett Johansson and Channing Tatum, who are two undeniable megastars, right? I don't think they are the strongest parts of this film. Some of my favorite characters are the supporting characters. Jim Rash plays this commercial director in it, and he is hilarious. Ray Romano plays another NASA worker he's actually a pretty dramatic role, and I think he does a really wonderful kind of understated job for him. Woody Harrelson is in it as a government operative. So when those folks, and also a cat, managed to take attention away from Scarlett Johansson and Channing Tatum, it's kind of one of those like, where's the balance here? It's directed by Greg Berlanti, who is probably best known for his work with the CW DC Comics shows. So like The Flash, Supergirl, he's also an EP on a bunch of stuff. I didn't know he directed it until the credits came up, and I went, oh, and I think actually a lot of people in the theater went, oh, as well. Like I said, I was pleasantly surprised by the number of highs in the film, but I was not as surprised by, the lows in it. If they'd shaved about 30 minutes off of it because it's a 2-hour and change film, I think it would have been so much cleaner. I like that Scarlett Johansson's character is a no-nonsense, like, powerful, empowered woman. She uses her femininity to her advantage. Like, I think that's handled pretty well within it. It feels very highly fictionalized, but, let's go with aspirational, and history doesn't always have to be dark. The most absurd part of it to me was Channing Tatum as the NASA, I think, control director, something along those lines, heavily involved in the launch of Apollo 11. And not to say that good-looking guys can't be super smart as well, but Channing Tatum does not read on screen to me as the most intelligent person. It's not to say he's stupid, but I think like a role like Magic Mike is perfect for him, where it's like, oh yeah, of course he's really smart about like small business things, but you wouldn't expect him to launch a space shuttle. Same thing goes for like, I remember the Tomorrow War with Chris Pratt, and they had him with all this technical mumbo jumbo, and I was just like, this is not who you cast for this. Channing Tatum, I don't think you don't cast him for this, because he also plays a pilot turned NASA person, and the pilot part, I was like, yeah, this works. But everyone else in NASA is in a white shirt and a black tie all the time, and then you have him in these really absurd, I'm sure era appropriate, like cut off sleeve sweaters, and you can always see his tank top under, and it's silly and it's hard to believe in a film full of things that are hard to believe, and I don't want to get caught up on the little things. I think Channing Tatum and Scarlett Johansson have some pretty decent on-screen chemistry. There's something about them, though, that I'm like, look, you're both objectively attractive, but there's not like a sexual tension between them, even though that is what the characters require. They're just, there's romance gonna happen, but I don't, it doesn't like fully sell it for me. It's very chaste, I think, is how I will say it. It's not like steamy. You're like, oh yeah, I want to see you make out. You're just like, I know this is probably going to end up in you smooching. Congrats? I don't know. You're rooting for them, but not that hard. Should you see this film is the big question. Like I said, pleasantly surprised by it, but that doesn't mean it's a great film and I would go out and recommend it. I think for this one, and I'm always slightly reticent to say this because I know that box office is such a huge part of this, and I get the feeling that a lot of folks were involved in the making of this film. This is an Apple TV and Sony co-venture, so it will end up on Apple TV at some point, and I think that's when you probably are gonna watch it. I don't know if I recommend running out to a theater to see it. I don't think that I would say this is the worst thing to see this weekend, but it's kind of a meh for me. I'm not gonna be like, oh my God, do not see this movie. If you watched the trailer and you went, oh, I think this looks nice, I think you will actually potentially enjoy yourself. If you watched the trailer and you went, not for me, it's also probably not for you. I often say trailers are misleading, but this one is an accurate one. This movie requires you to use no brain power, so if you want to just completely shut your brain off and go along for a relatively pleasant ride that's just a bit too long for its own good, by all means. I'm going to give it a 3.6 out of 5. The next thing I have this week is a series called Sunny, and is also from Apple TV+, and I absolutely loved this series. I was lucky enough to get to binge the whole thing. It's dropping weekly for everyone else, but it takes place in a basically modern-day Japan, and Rashida Jones stars as a character named Susie, and her husband and son go missing in a plane-related incident, and so she is obviously bereft, and so she is gifted a homebot in order to help deal with her grief. And, this is a not too distant future in which, people have personal robots. I described the robot itself as Eve from WALL-E and Johnny Five from Short Circuit. And now that I'm thinking about it, Rosie from the Jetsons all merged together into one robot. I love the character of Sunny. Sunny is the robot's name. I think she's spectacular. She is sassy. She is funny and snarky. And I like the exploration of humanity through the lens of a non-human character. Like, I often find myself drawn to the non-human characters and things. So this was just like made for me. There's also like a bonkers mystery component, and the Yakuza is involved, and it gets very high stakes. But my favorite moments of it are the interpersonal relationships between Sunny and Susie. Then there's another character called Mixie, played by Annie the Clumsy, and the friendship between the three of them and the jealousies and all the dynamics there. It's really fun, and you sometimes forget that one of these characters is a robot, and it's a practical robot, which is really cool. I'm so glad they actually had at least a stand-in for most of it. And then the face is animated. The voice of Sunny is Joanna Sotomura, who does just bring such life to it. The series also stars Hidetoshi Nishijima from Drive My Car, who plays Susie's husband. Judy Ong Yu, and yes, her name is YOU, from Terrace House is in this. Jun Kunimura. I really enjoyed the show. I think it is a really clever and heartwarming and also kind of heartbreaking meditation on what it takes to be human and like what makes us a person. And it's a question of autonomy. And there's also sort of a level of like Measure of a Man from Star Trek, which is the episode where they're trying to decide if Data actually has rights or is he property. That's not an exploration in this, but I like anything that explores what does it mean to be human. And it does not hurt that this is packaged up with some really adorable robots. The first 2 episodes of Sunny are streaming now on Apple TV+, and the rest are going to be dropping weekly. It is a 10-episode season. The last thing I have this week is also Japan adjacent. It's called Touch, and it is a film set at the beginning of the pandemic. It stars Egil Olafsson as a character who is searching for his long-lost love. He's an Icelandic man, and he met this Japanese woman in London when they were youths, and he's a rebellious academic who ends up working in a Japanese restaurant, and then they form a relationship, and then she disappears from his life. And so you get the 2 timelines of him searching for her in 2020, and then you have a younger set of actors playing them at the end of the 60s. My big thing about this movie, I think the premise of it is sweet. The challenge for me with it was the setting of it during the pandemic. And I get that it sort of adds a sense of urgency, obviously, because he is racing the clock as borders are closing. This character feels his time is running out because of both the pandemic and, other factors. And so he's just on a mission. However, to me, it just felt really irresponsible and selfish of this character to be running around all over the world, oftentimes unmasked, trying to find this woman, which, again, is supposed to be sweet and romantic, but I just kept getting taken out of it going, why aren't you wearing a mask? This isn't a spoiler necessarily, but there's just a moment in it where he's interfacing with someone, and the person is kind of being terse to him and being like, we need to close down. You are the last person here. Can you get out? And I know that the character who is addressing, our protagonist is doing it in a sassy way. And I think as the audience, we're meant to be, frustrated at the worker who's asking him this. But in my brain, I was just like, yeah, get out, dude. You're holding everybody who works here hostage because you are on this very selfish mission. This is all being said with like having lived through and continuing to live through pandemic like long after effects. And so I'm like, yeah, at the time it wasn't as obvious because again, it's clearly the very beginning of it. Like borders are just about to close. But I'm still like, yeah, dude, you're in the wrong. Like, history will prove that you're in the wrong by just gallivanting around and, on this own personal mission at the expense of the health and, wellness of others. So that took me out of it. The other thing that I won't say took me out of it, but my big thing about it is like, and some of this is just based on my background and all that stuff, I would have been much more interested in seeing this story from the female character's perspective because she has a more interesting story, honestly. I don't want to go into too much details about it, but there's a lot of cultural stuff about her background and why she ends up in London and all that stuff that I was like, I didn't know a lot of these factors and I don't think you would necessarily if you're not Japanese. And so to learn about them through this, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And, I feel like more people I wish knew about it. However, it's not the main plot, even though it is by far a much more challenging thing to tackle. And so I was like, I wish I had her story. And her story is intertwined with his, but he's just like a nice Icelandic dude who decides to go to school in London and be a bit rebellious, but there aren't a lot of consequences for him because he's a white man. And even though he is a, immigrant to the UK, he still blends in versus this Japanese woman and this group of Japanese expats in London that he becomes friends with. I was like, they all have much, much more intricate sets of circumstances. So why not make that story? And I know it's because it's based on an Icelandic novel about this topic, so I get why that person wrote it. But anyway, I think that would have been a much more complex and interesting story. And because of that, we get the simplified half of the relationship, which, it's, again, this is not a bad movie. I thought this was a sweet enough movie. So those are the factors for me that keep it as a good movie and not elevating it to a great movie. Overall, I'm going to give it a 3.8 out of 5.